Welcome to From the South. I am Luis de Jesus from the Telesur studios in Caracas, Venezuela. Let's take a look at our headlines. National Hurricane Center places Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands on the watch as the 13th tropical depression is moving toward the Caribbean and is expected to develop into Tropical Storm Laura in the next hours. In the United States, the Democratic National Convention came to an end on Thursday with Joe Biden as the party's official candidate for the November presidential election. And the Economic Community of West African States discussed on Thursday an extraordinary meeting to address the political crisis in Mali. And we begin with the news. Stay with us. The National Hurricane Center has placed Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands on their watch because of the path of the 13th tropical depression, which is expected to become the Tropical Storm Laura in the next hours. It is set to pass north of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico on Saturday. Forecasts indicate it could ramp up to a hurricane with 75-mile-per-hour winds by early next week, when it is due to hit South Florida. Meanwhile, Tropical Depression number 14 is expected to develop into a tropical storm Thursday night, in which case it would be named Marco, bringing maximum winds of over 45 miles per hour and heavy rains to the coast of Honduras and the Bay Islands. The two depressions have prompted tropical storm watch alerts for multiple Caribbean islands. In an exclusive interview with Telesur, candidate for the presidency of Ecuador, Andrés Arauz, spoke about the political persecution that leaders of the Citizens' Revolution movement have suffered for the past 3 years under the Lenin Moreno administration.
I know that I wasn't a direct victim of such a brutal persecution because I didn't have that high profile. The competitors who had a political protagonism, those who were at the front in defense of the Revolution Ciudadana movement, were persecuted. In defense of their principles, they were extremely persecuted. So we have to commit ourselves as a society to no longer follow that path.
Arauz also noted that Ecuadorian citizens are fully aware of the broken promises of current President Moreno.
We have to look forward when we have a clear political idea, when there is a historical conscience of the role we play and the one we are assuming in the society. I don't think we should take into account the treason.
Unions and teachers in Uruguay continue as mobilized in Montevideo in reaction to the cut in the educational budget. Education and trade union workers indicated that the government uses the pandemic as a pretext to make possible cuts in education budget, which could deteriorate the education system, affecting students. In the same way, teachers pointed out that the initiatives of the government of Luis Lacalle Pou to cut budgets would lead to the reduction of labor rights and the elimination of free education programs. They also point out that the implementation of the urgent consideration law limits to state-run public institutions and would threaten to privatize the sector.
High school teachers all over the country have many strikes. Today, the third day, is over because there is a budget cut, a fiscal adjustment, which has nothing to do with the pandemic. The pandemic has been an excuse. It had already been raised in the election season. A cut that means a superpopulated group. There's going to be over 2,000 teachers left without jobs. And when you talk about education campaign, you don't really see the numbers. As adjusted as in all Latin American in education and health. And before the cut, there will be struggle. The protests we demand will have struggle and conflicts and strikes, because the most unprotected sectors, that are those who attend public education, must help them. We must help them with smaller groups, with multidisciplinary teams, and all that is cut, a 22% cut in public education.
Speaking on Cuban television's Mesa Redonda programs this Thursday, the Director General of the Finlay Institute of Vaccines offered information regarding the clinical trial of the vaccine candidate known as Finlay FR1.
We wanted to say this is a step which in terms of coronavirus is considered a major step There are over 200 vaccine candidates in development in the world, and only 30. This is the 30th that secured approval to start the clinical trial. On the screen you can see there's a website on the New York Times called Coronavirus Vaccine Tracker, and on that website a few days ago it was reported that our vaccine, developed by the Finland Institute of Vaccines, had received approval to start the clinical trial on August 24th.
Estamos haciendo un ensayo fase 1, fase 2.
We have to ensure an effective clinical trial. We are conducting clinical trials at phase 1 and phase 2, which they are due to finalize by the end of November, and as noted on the public website of the Cuban Public Register of Clinical Trials, they are set to conclude with the final review from January 20th to February 20th, which is the moment when the report concludes. But as we have developed everything, we haven't waited until the publication of the final report. We will have partial evaluation reports on phase 1 and phase 2, and if the results are positive, they will allow us to begin to evaluate the effectiveness.
And healthcare personnel conducted a COVID-19 preventative campaign in Peru's capital, Lima, aimed at testing the most vulnerable population in order to curb the spread of the virus. Peru has reported the second highest number of coronavirus cases in South America.
Peru is carrying out targeted operations in order to prioritize attention to vulnerable populations. These vulnerable populations are the elderly and those who suffer from some form of illness. The information systems in our country are being more rigorous. We are being more demanding and trying to notify and record all cases, or all the screened cases that we can identify. I have been through this illness already. Thank God I'm able to communicate with you, but I would have liked you to have listened to me when I called, when I asked for help, and you did not come. It's good that they can come so they can help us, because sometimes it's very difficult to know if you are sick or not.
And Panamanian authorities have relaxed the restrictive measures imposed during the coronavirus pandemic after a 5-month lockdown. According to Health Minister Luis Francisco Sucre, restrictions on movement according to people's identity card numbers will be eliminated as of Monday, August 24th. The move comes after several economic sectors were allowed to reopen this week. Since the first COVID-19 case was detected in Panama on March 9th, the country has reported almost 84,000 cases and close to 2,000 deaths. And Guyana has registered 4 new COVID-19 deaths this week. The latest fatalities bring the country's death toll to 27. The latest 2 COVID-19 deaths were reported on August 19th, according to figures from the Ministry of Health. A total of 776 coronavirus cases have been confirmed to date.
So how are Guyanese faring?
I will be right back after this short break, so stay with us. In the United States, the Democratic National Convention ended on Thursday with Joe Biden's official speech as its candidate for the November 3rd presidential election. Different political and artistic personalities addressed at the virtual meeting several issues as the health crisis, the prevention of gun violence, the economic crisis and racial inequality, migration and climate change. Former California attorney and Senator Kamala Harris accepted the nomination as a candidate for vice president and running mate of Biden. For the upcoming November 3rd elections, it is also remarkable that the migrants' vote becomes more important as 32 million migrants will be able to vote. U.S. President Donald Trump's former top advisor, Steve Bannon, was released after being charged with fraud over a fundraising scheme to build a wall on the border of Mexico. Bannon, one of the architects of Trump's 2016 elections victory and a champion of nationalist leaders around the world, was charged along with 3 others accused of defrauding hundreds of thousands of people who donated to campaign. According to the prosecutors, the funds were actually used by 3 to cover their own personal expenses, with Bannon receiving over $1 million through an unnamed nonprofit organization. However, this Thursday, New York State judicial authorities released Bannon under a $5 million bond.
What you're going to see is that Steve Bannon is going to become a football right now in the presidential election, at least for the next few weeks, unless something else pops up in the news cycle. The indictment looks really strong. You don't get weak indictments out of the Southern District of New York. And if you just look what's out there on front that the U.S. Attorney put on the page there, it's pretty astounding. So this is not about politics. It's about fraud. If you look at the indictment, what you see is that Bannon and Baldolado with this organization promised the investors or promised the contributors to this organization that every penny would go to building the wall with Mexico. And in fact, they consistently defrauded those contributors. The head of the organization took $350,000. Bannon himself took $1 million. They engaged in a variety of activities to cover this up.
And the number of Americans filing a new claim for unemployment benefits rose unexpectedly back above the 1 million last week, a setback for a struggling U.S. job market crippled by the coronavirus pandemic. In a sign that some rehiring is underway, the rolls of those continuing to receive jobless benefits is slowly declining, the Labor Department reported on Thursday. Data that indicated a recovery from the recession triggered by COVID-19 continues, though at a more fitful pace than earlier. Thousands of people fled their homes in the U.S. state of California on Wednesday following a wave of fast-moving wildfires which have already claimed the life of a helicopter pilot. Residents were urged to evacuate during the night in the city of Vacaville as the flames destroyed dozens of homes. Evacuation orders or warnings have been issued in several counties where fires sparked by lightning are raging unchecked amid a sweltering heat wave. Meanwhile, officials reported that a helicopter pilot who was taking part in the firefighting efforts in Fresno County, southeast of San Francisco, had died in a crash as he was attempting to drop water. The defense minister of Belarus has ordered the reinforcement of troops in the western region of Grodno on the border with Poland and Lithuania in the face of the threat of foreign interference in the country. Earlier, President Alexander Lukashenko stressed that the increase in NATO activities on the nation's western borders was a cause for concern. During a meeting of the Security Council, the president ordered the defense ministry to keep a close eye on the moves of the NATO forces. Troops in Grodno are already carrying out military exercises involving infantry and tank battalions, as well as artillery and airborne troops. Tactical missile units, drones, and air defense systems have also been deployed. German Chancellor and rotating President of the European Union Council, Angela Merkel, has called for stability in the Eastern Mediterranean region following weeks of diplomatic tensions between Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey.
We need stability there and not tension. We have a very critical situation there. I am convinced that if Germany and France join forces here, we will find good solutions that will hopefully make cooperation possible. But that will also make clear that we will not accept attacks on the sovereignty of member states of the European Union. We are in favor of solving problems through discussion and not by escalating tensions, and that applies to all parties involved.
And China's vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic will be available and affordable to people worldwide, said in Beijing Liu Jingzhen, chairman of China National Pharmaceutical Group. A ceremony took place in the capital on Thursday to launch phase 3 clinical trials for the vaccine in Peru. Peru's national health authorities have approved the trials, the latest in China's efforts to strengthen international cooperation in pandemic control. Liu said that China's biotech group is carrying out the research with experts from some of Peru's leading universities. Liu pointed out to research and production facilities in Beijing and Wuhan, which was hit the hardest by the virus, that could ensure the supply of 200 million vaccines a year.
We launched the promotion of international clinical trials in April, so we are making key breakthroughs in the United Arab Emirates, which have been very successful. Today, we established a cooperation relationship with Peru and officially received the documents in all aspects, and will soon start equity participation. Up to now, the clinical phase 3 trials, from the experimental point of view, the layout is completely sufficient. We launched the promotion of international clinical trials in April, so we are making key breakthroughs in the United Arab Emirates, which have been very successful. Today, we established a cooperation relationship with Peru and officially received the documents in all aspects, and will soon start equity participation. Up to now, the clinical phase 3 trials, from the experimental point of view, the layout is completely sufficient.
And the director of the Russian Direct Investment Fund announced this Thursday that a large-scale clinical trials on the potential coronavirus vaccine named Sputnik V will start next week with the participation of 40,000 people. Director Kirill Dmitriev stated that this stage of clinical trials will be carried out in full compliance with international standards. According to the trials previously conducted, the vaccine's most common side effects are pain in the area where the injection was administered and headaches. Some volunteers also experienced hypothermia. The vaccine's effectiveness was assessed based on the participants' immune response, with results showing that 100% developed antibodies that neutralize the virus. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Following the coup against Malian President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta this week, representatives of the economic community of West African states held an extraordinary meeting on Thursday to address the situation in the country. Our correspondent Jefferson Gomez has the details.
The immunity has been widely condemned by international communities and Mali's regional partners. For instance, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which represents 15 countries in the region, has decided to close its member states' borders with Mali. Meanwhile, the United Nations has called for the immediate restoration of the constitutional order and justice in Mali. In an extraordinary meeting held early this morning, regional leaders decided to send a technical mission to Mali in order to mediate in the negotiations aimed at normalizing the internal situation, and they have also decided to impose sanctions against the insurgent military officers and their allies.
And thank you to Jefferson for that report. And authorities in Mozambique have decided to ease some COVID-19 restriction measures, including the reopening of higher education institutions. Slade Mutemba has the details.
Started to ease some control measures aimed at curbing the spread of the novel coronavirus. Some sectors considered to be low risk have already resumed activities, among them higher and technical education. The government has decided to advance on the issuing of national ID cards and identity and residency documents for foreigners. This is the second state of emergency aimed at supporting COVID-19 preventive and control measures. At this moment, Mozambique has surpassed 3,000 positive cases. Analyzing the African continent, the largest number of COVID-19 cases and fatalities have been reported in Southern Africa. South Africa is the worst-hit country and was under lockdown for 5 months. This week, the South African government decided to ease restrictions by allowing alcohol and tobacco sales.
Thank you to Slade Mutemba for that report. Russian authorities have rejected the U.S. call to restore sanctions against Iran. Russia's permanent representatives to international organizations in Vienna, Mikhail Ulenov, said that the United States was about to make a big mistake, which could have extremely negative implications not only for the U.S. but for the United Nations as a whole. The Russian official described Trump's claim that the U.S. remains a participant in the 2015 nuclear deal as illogical, given that it withdrew from the deal in 2018. He further underlined the need for the countries that still respect the agreement to remain firm in their position in the face of Washington's destabilizing efforts. Israeli Air Force has continued bombing the Palestinian territory of the Gaza Strip for 10 consecutive days. Palestinian authorities point out that the attacks of recent days have mainly affected houses and agricultural territories and describe them as an attempt by Tel Aviv to distract public attention from the political crisis in Israel. And also, the United Nations Security Council held a meeting on the international situation in Somalia this Thursday, where elections due in November have been postponed due to the novel coronavirus pandemic.
It is, of course, up to Somali stakeholders to determine a model that will guide the electoral process. Nonetheless, we urge that such a model be arrived at through inclusive dialogue and compromise. It should be informed also by principles, including that it must preserve the tradition of peaceful rotation in office every 4 years.
The resumption of dialogue between the federal government and the federal member states has the real potential to act as a catalyst for achieving critical national priorities. I'm encouraged so far that the resumption of dialogue has already allowed for Somali stakeholders at all levels to engage in frank and inclusive discussions in search of a consensual approach to the issue of elections and its modalities.
Restaurants have reopened in the Algerian capital under strict hygiene and social distancing measures after 5 months of closure due to the coronavirus.
When we receive the customers, they can only enter if they are authorized, as waiting is not allowed inside the restaurant. Once they are allowed to enter, they have to wipe their feet on a disinfectant mat. They have to put the hydroalcoholic gel on their hands. Then they are taken to their table, and there is a distance of at least 1.5 meters between each table. But I always try to do more. We have an extra job. We are police officers, unfortunately. Because people are not used to going out, as soon as they come in, they think they will take off the mask when the goal is to keep it on during their trip. Even when they go to the washroom, they are obliged to put the mask on. They should avoid moving around as much as possible.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember that you can find these and many other stories at our website at telesurenglish.net. And you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Luis de Jesus. Thank you for watching.